And, you know, in keeping with what I generally try to do at this event, you know, let's get the main players up on stage and just have a discussion, you know. I mean, I know people in the offshore world are, particularly with the latest one, the Paradise Papers, are, you know, pretty pissed off. And I tried to get the main partner of Appleby to, or anyone from Appleby to participate. And quite frankly, if I was the head of Appleby, you could not stop me from coming to an event like this and participating. You know, I would be that motivated, I'd be that emotional about what happened that you couldn't stop me, but for whatever reason, they don't want to participate. But what they have done is, just like they did in London, at our London conference in November, they sent me a statement that they want me to read on their behalf, which I'll do shortly. But, you know, I'll introduce the people who were prepared, you know, to come and discuss this. So, this gentleman here is Frederick Obermeyer, and he's an investigative journalist for the Munich-based daily newspaper. It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, I believe, daily newspapers in Germany. And I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Süddeutsche, something like that. And together with his colleague, Bastian Obermeyer, you know, they were the first point of contact for both of these major leaks, the Panama and Paradise Papers. You know, these were the journalists to whom this data was first leaked, which, you know, to actually get one of those leaks is extraordinary. To get both of them is suspicious, I would say.
That's what you say.
And then next to Frederick is Gerard Ryle, who's spoken a few times at our events. Gerard is an Irish-Australian investigative reporter. He's director of the ICIJ, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. And the ICIJ won a Pulitzer Prize last year in the explanatory reporting category. And then next along the line, we have the Honorable Michael Dunkley, MP, a long-serving member of the Bermuda legislature, I think since 1997 or thereabouts. And Michael served as Premier of Bermuda from May of 2014 to July of 2017. And Michael's also a businessman, Vice President and CEO of Dunkley's Dairy, a milk processing plant and one of Bermuda's biggest food importers. And he's Vice President of Island Properties, a property management company in Bermuda, and President of Dunkley's Management Holdings, a management consulting company. And then next to Michael is the Honorable Bob Richards. Bob has served for many years, or he did serve before he retired, many years as a senator and an MP in Bermuda, including serving as Deputy Premier and Finance Minister. And Bob is an an investment manager by profession, most notably with Bermuda Asset Management. And, you know, I used to live in Bermuda from 1990 to 1996. That's when I first knew both Bob and Michael, and it's the first time I think I've seen either of them since 1996. So, you know, before we, you know, get into the session, so I'm going to read a statement from Michael O'Connell, Group Managing Partner of Appleby. And, you know, I must admit I don't like reading other people's words, you know. I much would have preferred that they come here. But anyway, this is the statement. You know, as you are going to be spending sometime over the next 2 days discussing my firm and our clients, I feel it is appropriate once again to make a statement in relation to the criminal act to which Appleby has been subjected. In 2016, Appleby was subjected to a sustained and highly sophisticated cyber attack, and our property was stolen. These are confidential and privileged documents relating to many of our clients. It has euphemistically been referred to as a leak. This implies that someone in my firm handed information to an outside party. That did not happen. This was an illegal theft, and the stolen documents were then used by the ICIJ and journalists from media organizations across the world. These journalists have made use of stolen property. As we said in the statement we made to your event attendees in London in November, we have engaged with the ICIJ and its media partners. We have answered their questions where it did not breach client confidentiality, and we have tried to correct inaccuracies and educate where they have misunderstood the role of an offshore law firm. On the part of the media, they continue to appear to give no consideration as to whether the documents give rise to any matter of public interest, or that they raise matters of sufficient importance to justify the major violation of confidence, privilege, and privacy. It is also important to note that the ICIJ has refused to help us by returning any of our stolen property that they have in their possession, even though there is no conceivable way in which it would identify the source which naturally they wish to protect. There has been no wrongdoing on our part. However, by being prepared to use highly confidential stolen documents without justification, journalists are simply emboldening the actions of these serious criminal cyber hackers and facilitating them in future to repeat this crime. On this occasion, we are talking about confidential and privileged data stolen from a law firm. Unless this activity is confronted and seen for what it is, serious criminal activity, next time it could be your personal data, your private details, your health records, etc. We suggest that this ought to be of primary public concern. Today, it is Appleby's stolen property. Tomorrow, it will be yours. Throughout this incident, our clients have remained our focus, and they will continue to be central to any actions we take. We continue to be grateful for the tremendous support we have received from our clients, my colleagues, our referrers, and our business communities, and we would like to thank them all. And then it says, again, please ensure this statement is read in full on behalf of Michael O'Connell. So why don't we just kick off? And I want this to be an informal Q&A. Nobody's going to make any big presentations, show, huge, slides or whatever. I mean, this is the dominant theme in the offshore world. I'm sure many of you, I'm sure all of you have opinions, the sort of opinions, you express in private, in bars. I'm sure some of you have said this is disgraceful, blah, blah, blah. And some of you said, good on the, the ICIJ, I mean, it's a very polarizing topic. So the way we're going to handle this is I have some questions prepared to get the ball rolling. But at any time, if any of you wants to ask a question or even, make a statement sort of dressed up as a question, because you want to get something off your chest, stick your hand up. I've got my staff with roving mics, and let's just make it, conversation and get through, all the material issues. So why don't we kick off with Gerard? And we don't need to explain. I don't need to explain what these leaks are. Everybody knows, right? So I'm not going to bore you with, it was 2 terabytes of information, blah 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 blah. It was basically a pain in the neck for 2 law firms, 2 very different law firms, in my opinion. So let's kick off with Gerard. Hopefully you were listening to the statement I read from Appleby. What are your comments on? And I can read from the transcript if you need me to refresh your memory about parts of them.
I was confused by one statement in there where he says that we have refused to return documents to Appleby. I don't recall being asked. I understand that they are actually asking the BBC and the Guardian in Britain, but they haven't come to challenge the ICIJ, which is based in the US. I will say that the ICIJ has not partaken in any criminality of any kind. We're actually doing everything within US law. We went to our lawyers and asked whether or not we could port out these documents. We were told we could. It's perfectly legal what we're doing.
So in terms of stolen data handling, stolen goods, Frederick, could you, I know you probably have to be very careful. Can you give us some indication of how this data was, given to you and Bastian, without breaking any, confidences?
I hope that you understand that Süddeutsche Zeitung, as a matter of a general policy, we don't go into detail how, from whom we get leaked data. But as a general policy, whatever data we get from whistleblowers, informants, one of our first steps is to check if we do see any public interest. And this is not an easy process for us. There are many lawyers involved in this, many editors, all our editors-in-chief are involved in this process. And we do definitely see a huge public interest in the Panama Papers as well as the Paradise Papers publications.
Did you solicit the I don't want to call it a leak, did you encourage the person to go and obtain data and give it to you?
No. Süddeutsche Zeitung, every journalist, we do never encourage people to obtain data on whichever way. We do, nevertheless, on our webpage, explain to our readers and potential whistleblowers how they can leak data to us on a secure and encrypted way. And there are many ways, so if you want to look them up and leak data to us, of course you can find it on our webpage. You can find it on my Twitter handle and on my personal webpage as well.
So, and when you get the data, it's not a case, is it, that you'll just publish whatever, right? You make a decision about what's in the public interest, the relevance.
Well, for us, it's very important that we don't want to act to basically dump original data in the internet, like, for example, WikiLeaks does it. For us, it's very important to find the stories of public interest there and publish them, put them in a context, give people, law firms like Appleby, the possibility to comment before we publish it. We, of course, put all these comments in our reporting because that's a general standard that we work under.
And do you, I'm not expecting you to give me any name or anything, but do you actually know the identity, or you or Bastian know the identity of the person or persons, who provided the information, or don't you?
I don't know the identity of the Panama Papers whistleblower, and in regards to the Paradise Papers, we, Süddeutsche Zeitung, do not comment in any way on these issues.
Has anyone from your newspaper been subpoenaed, to ask questions, in a court of law or before an authority where they might ask you these sorts of questions?
No, not in Germany.
Have you been sued?
We have been sued in one case that is a law case that we in the end won. That was not related to the Paradise Papers.
We have a question over here. Can you turn on the mic?
It is on. Yep. Oh, thanks. Yeah, all right. What's your name? Right, where do you live? All right, okay. Sorry, yeah, okay, we're live now. Okay, for people who are interested in what's actually happening in the Appleby case, you can actually download or just ask me for the pleadings, because we took them out of the Rolls building for various reasons. And what you're going to end up with, I think, is a case that will go all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it is going to be a straight dispute on my analysis, and it's a brief analysis, between the public interest argument, which is being run by The Guardian and the other...
So you're talking about the lawsuit that was filed against the BBC and The Guardian by Appleby in London, right?
Yeah. I think what that will do for any common law country with an English root is it's going to settle the law on this, because it looks like a very straight dispute between, on the one side, yes, they're stolen, and on the other side, the only real defence is, well, there's a public interest element to it. So it's going to be very cutting edge. Anybody wants the pleadings, ask me. I've actually got them on my iPad here, but they are available as a public document, and you can see how the dispute's going to come out. In a few years' time, we will get, I would think, the Supreme Court is going to say, this is what the law is on this area.
And what's the consensus in the legal community that you've heard as to who's likely to prevail?
I don't think there is a consensus, because you've got those sort of vague, you've got the sort of human rights angle, you've got public interest. These are not completely defined characteristics. So the law is going to evolve, and it will give the Supreme Court something to chew on, I think. But it's going to be interesting. But those are the two competing bits. And it's going to settle it not only for them, but it's going to settle it for a lot of other people. Document theft for professional people is a big problem, leaving on one side the public interest.
So I'd like to ask Gerard and Frederick, I mean, how do you view OFCs? I mean, do you think that the mere fact that, they exist is somehow suspicious or indicative of, immoral, questionable activity? Do you think they have a legitimate use?
Well, I think the real issue is the secrecy that you find in the offshore world. That's, I think, what is in the public interest. The fact that we don't know what's happening, and we haven't known what's been happening for almost 100 years before the ICIJ started getting these leaks. We started publishing in 2013, and it was the very first time that we were able to see behind the veil of secrecy. And I think, that for me is always the biggest issue, is that, here, and I think what is really hurting the offshore world was the Paradise Papers investigation, because we were dealing with primarily Appleby. It wasn't the entire leak, because it was only about 7 million of the 13 million documents. But we're talking about a very upmarket law firm. It wasn't like Mossack Fonseca, which everyone thought was a criminal organization. Appleby's clients were the biggest, the richest people in the world, the biggest corporations in the world. And I think it really sort of showed the systemic problem with the offshore world in a way that hadn't been shown before. This wasn't an outlier firm. This was basically, it showed that the offshore world allowed you to play by different rules. We all live in democracies, and we think that the principal issue in a democracy is that we all play by the same rules. Well, clearly, the offshore world is allowing people to play by different rules, and I think that's what's really hurting here. One thing I will say about the court case itself, it's interesting that Appleby is asking if they could get access to the clients that we got information on. Well, I'll say to you that that information is already public. It's already on the OffshoreLeaks website, which is published by ICIJ. Any of the clients that we have information on is there already. It's already out there in the public. There's no need to go through a lawsuit over it.
You got 7 million records. Why didn't you get the other 6 million?
Well, again, I'm not sure if you're referring to the statements that have been made in court. I'm not sure how public they are yet. But the Paradise Papers was about 13.4 million documents. It wasn't all about Appleby. There was a second law firm in there called Asia City, and there were also the registries of various offshore jurisdictions, such as the Cayman Islands, Cook Islands, and other places. So it was an amalgamation of about 20 different document sets that came to Süddeutsche Zeitung. We just put them all together into one investigation.
So you didn't get Appleby's entire records,
We don't know. We actually don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Frederick, how do you view OFCs? Do you think there's any legitimate, did they serve any legitimate purpose at all?
Well, of course you can use them for a legitimate purpose, but I do in general, and that's no matter if it's onshore or offshore, I do see a need for transparency. I think that it's in the public interest to know who is the beneficial owner of a certain company, to know with whom you're doing business with, to basically also prevent that you're doing business with the wrong guys. Because we all know that there's sanctions lists, that there's several people where you do have red flags, and I do see a need for corporations to know that they are not doing business with those guys. In all those leaks and investigations that are already mentioned, offshore leaks, Swiss leaks, Paradise Papers, Panama Papers, we have seen in many cases that there's sanctions people who, for example, use those opaque company structures to go on doing their business also that they're sanctioned. And for me personally, I do see a need that society, that if there are sanctions, that we can make sure that those people don't use those company structures to bypass them.
We have a question here.
Yeah, the question of the offshore secrecy jurisdictions comes down to the fundamental legitimacy of government, of democracy, and of the institutions like the IRS. There's a tremendous amount of anger expressed in the United States and in other countries that systems are rigged. And by that, they don't just mean elections are rigged, but they mean that the average person, who you might call a turbo taxpayer, the best they can do is get a piece of software to try to navigate a 1040 form and pay their taxes. And the amount of transparency for them is extraordinary. You could live in 10 different states in the United States, and you could work in 10 different places, and the IRS would know every penny you made over the course of that year. Meanwhile, if you're wealthy and can afford the wealth defense industry to work on your behalf, you move into secrecy jurisdictions and you don't pay taxes. And the population is aware of that. And it undercuts the very legitimacy of the system. So the value of what ICIJ has done is you've taken the lid off of what people suspect is there, and you've given it substance. And does that agitate the conversation in society? Yes. But is it absolutely essential to a democracy? Also, yes. So, I actually have trouble understanding what value there is in secrecy jurisdictions, what positive value there is that is contributing whether to nations like the United States or to the global community. And I would like those who would defend them to speak up and say, what is the value exactly?
So that's a good place to bring Michael and Bob in. Would you like to respond to the question about, sort of essentially what value does Bermuda bring to the international financial community?
Yeah, thank you, David.
And do you object to Bermuda being described, let's assume all offshore centers being lumped in with that term, secrecy jurisdiction? What are your comments on just that as a descriptive term?
Yeah, thank you. And
the U.S. is also a secrecy jurisdiction. Let's be clear. Yeah. One of the biggest in the world.
The number one on the ratings that you sent around. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'll be happy to start off, and then my colleague will say a few things. It's uncomfortable because normally when we talk with reporters on the other side of the table, but we're sitting on the same side of the table today. So I can't see your face and your expressions and things like that. But the reason why I accepted the invitation to come, and I'm sure my colleagues can speak for himself, is that we feel it's appropriate to speak in the public interest, to continue to tell people about Bermuda, what we stand for, what we do. We're not perfect, but we've worked for many, many years to be a transparent jurisdiction and to do things the right way. And so I came here today not specifically to talk about Appleby, but to talk generally about Bermuda and have the ability to answer some questions that you might have. We have a lot to be proud of in the history of Bermuda, and to specifically answer your question, sir, what does Bermuda do? Well, we're not your typical offshore financial center. We are probably best known for being paradise in the world. Everyone else, Cayman and BVI, they all think they're paradise, but the paradise is 1,000 miles out in the middle of the ocean in Bermuda. But what we do in business, and that was for you right there. I hope you print that in your paper tomorrow. What we do, we're known for being one of the top 3 insurance centers in the world with London and New York. And we actually help facilitate trade, and we take some of the risks from around the world and make that pay when disaster hits. So for example, 9/11, most of you will recall 9/11 back in 2001. Bermuda covered 1/10 of 9/11 claims and was the first jurisdiction to pay billions of dollars through our reinsurance companies. We heard the presentation earlier where BVI talked about a hurricane they had last year. Well, hurricanes happen every season, and it seems like every year they're getting more and more intense. But in hurricane record in Bermuda reinsurance, probably one of the worst years on record was 2005 when you had Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. Bermuda paid 30% of the insured losses for those hurricanes. $22 billion right here in this country rebuilt the Florida and the Gulf Coast. Over the last 15 years, Bermuda, through our insurance-based companies, has contributed $35 billion to U.S. catastrophe losses. And that goes throughout the world. Bermuda, our economic model of reinsurance, not only is there probably 4,000 jobs that are directly attributed to that industry in Bermuda, with over half of those being Bermudians, but throughout the world, we can confidently say that there's over 350,000 jobs contributed in the United States because of that, probably close to 100,000 in the UK and over 30,000 in Canada alone. So that model works, and I can talk about UK flood losses. I can talk about Costa Concordia sinking back in, when was it? I think it was in 2012, where we contributed 50% of the loss for that. So our industry, which we're proud of in reinsurance, works, and it works properly. Now, there always is a balance between transparency and privacy, as one of the earlier panelists talked about. And that's a balance that everyone will wrestle with as we go forward. But we're proud of our reputation of tackling things head on. We'll continue to do the best that we can to raise the bar at all times. And we've been a very cooperative jurisdiction for years. Bermuda is not a place to hide money. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thanks, Michael. I'd like to start off with a rhetorical question. My journalist friends, because they've already answered the question, but I'll put it another way. My rhetorical question is, what is the name of the person that stole the data from Applebee's? And I think their answer is basically, it's a secret. All right? Journalists can have secrets, but Appleby can't. That is the essential problem here. We're living in a world of double standards and hypocrisy. Hypocrisy, hypocrisy, hypocrisy. So you have people who make laws, big countries, make laws and regulations for the world. I found the young gentleman who spoke about U.S. taxpayers, and I appreciate his point of view. Sir, the global financial system was designed by the United States, for the United States, after World War II. The global system we have here today, financial system, is a U.S. system, okay? And what we have here is a situation where large countries make laws and requirements for small countries and themselves. And countries like Bermuda, Cayman, BVI, all the offshore world that was put up on the screen earlier, there are hoops that we have to jump through. And some of us are better at jumping through those hoops than others. But what is curious is that the countries that make the rules don't abide by them themselves. This is the essential problem, that there is a double standard in this world. I have to, if I might, proceed with just a little story of something that happened to me very shortly after I became Minister of Finance of Bermuda. I was in London, and I was confronted by, astonishingly to me, a great deal of vitriolic and strong criticism of overseas territories by the NGO community and the media. And we were confronted with a demonstration in the UK against overseas territories. And for those of you who are familiar with London, you should get an idea of the size of this demonstration. The leading elements of this demonstration arrived at Westminster, at Big Ben, the House of Parliament, while the tail end of this demonstration had not yet left its origin, which was the Bank of England. This was a parade, a demonstration that was over 3 miles long, over 100,000 people, against overseas territories. And you know what the narrative was? The narrative was that tax havens were, quote, stealing food out of the mouths of starving babies in Africa. Now, how could that be? Well, here was the narrative. Their narrative was that multinational corporations were in extractive industries in Africa. And they were shifting their profits out of Africa to tax havens. And they were bribing corrupt politicians in Africa. And those corrupt politicians in Africa were also shifting their ill-gotten gains to tax havens. And that money that was shifted away was money that could be spent to feed starving babies in Africa. Therefore, ipso facto, tax havens were stealing food out of the mouths of starving babies in Africa. And you know, never mind the fact that, you know, none of these people, the companies, or the politicians were ever brought to justice in any country. And never mind the fact that a simple excise tax, you know, charge X dollars per bushel, per ton, per carat, whatever, per barrel, could have totally defeat profit shifting. Never mind the fact that a lot of these companies are big companies listed in the London Stock Exchange and form pensions of the NGO community, and virtually every Briton who works, their pensions get invested in these companies, including journalists. Right? They get invested in these same companies. Never mind all that. It was somehow the fault of the dots on the map, the tax havens. And you know, so this was the essential problem that we faced. And so there is a mindset that is pervasive in many countries, that is fed and reinforced by the media. And I have to say, it's not just the tabloid media. It is the so-called respected and trusted media that reinforce these negative stereotypes for overseas territories and other dots on the map, things that we have to go through. This brings me to my slide, David. So if I can present this slide here. Whoops. I just messed it up. There you go. Now, I have to say,
that's you when you had hair.
Well, it's not me when I had hair. But, you know, I want to say to you one thing, right? In defense of the journalists, I have a great respect for The Economist. I read it a lot. And The article inside this magazine was very balanced and very well researched. But all of that effort was totally defeated by this cover, which stereotypes offshore financial centers. Totally. You got a fat cat guy there with a grin, with a phrase that I can't use to describe that grin in public, in polite society, but the rest of it is eating, eating grin. All right? You got a pile of gold in the background and another pile of money on a tiny island with a palm tree. I mean, come on. This is stereotyping. And where is this $20 trillion, David? Where is it? I don't know. $20 trillion is a lot of money, all right? But I just know one thing, that if you take up all the dots on the map in the world, you add them up, and you take all the vaults that we have and all the mattresses that we have, you cannot fit $20 trillion in them, all right? So if it is $20 trillion, it's got to be in the same OECD countries that are making the rules, because 20 trillion can only be in major banks and securities markets. So I'll stop there, David. But set the stage. This is about hypocrisy. It's about double standards.
Actually, agree with some of your points, actually. I do think that the money doesn't end up in the offshore world. It does stay. I mean, it's really just, what's happening here is everything's just being moved around on paper. It allows big companies. I mean, let's look at some of the clients of Appleby, biggest one being Apple. And after we published the story, Apple said they were going to repatriate, I think, bring $38 billion back into the US, basically taxes that they hadn't paid. They were able to do that because they were able to basically park their tax losses overseas. I mean, it's been portrayed that this is a victimless sort of industry, but it isn't. I mean, we've come across over the last 5 years of researching this, it's allowed, child soldiers basically in Africa, looking at blood diamonds. Again, if you look at one of Appleby's clients was Saddam Hussein, a front company for Saddam Hussein. The head of the Angola Wealth Fund was sacked and I think is now going to jail. He was also one of the clients. So you're talking about Africa. There's a statistic that I read that 1/3 of the wealth in Africa is actually in offshore tax havens.
I wonder where they get this money from, these numbers from.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is if you
fling these numbers, that number is as legitimate as this 20 trillion.
If on the one hand the argument is that offshore secrecy doesn't allow us to know what's going on, then you have to accept that nobody has, can accurately say that this amount of money is being, lost or isn't being lost. I mean, if there's secrecy, you really just don't know, right?
That's the whole point. If you don't know what's going on, no one's able to account for it. And I agree with you. There's an awful lot of hypocrisy out there. I mean, one of the stories that we revealed was that the Queen of England was secretly investing in a predatory finance firm. Basically, this is a firm that was charging her own subjects, the poorest subjects, huge interest rates for hire purchase goods. You looked at Bono, the U2 star, a fellow Irishman, who was campaigning against offshore tax havens, but was found to have, through his finance firms, an investment in Lithuania that wasn't paying tax. I understand that the One campaign, which is what Bono heads up, he's the figurehead for it, was planning. They somehow got a whisper that we were coming out with the Paradise Papers and had actually planned a campaign around tax havens, but had to immediately withdraw it when they found out that Bono himself was actually involved here and was going to be named. So there's a lot of hypocrisy. Yeah, I agree with you.
But that investment, actually, I believe he made that through a Malta company, and it was publicly available from the Malta register, but his name isn't Bono. It's is it Hewson or something Hewson or something? It was actually there in the public record, under his own name. So I don't think he made any attempt to.
But let's state one thing clearly here. His name was publicly available if you knew the company name. And that's a big problem because many jurisdictions are always talking about information being publicly available. But if this information is only publicly available if you already know the company name, that's a problem. So that's why I think if you want to solve the problem, if you want some cure for your reputation problem, the cure is transparency. It's transparency. Put all your beneficial ownership information that you seem to have, make it publicly available. Why don't you do it?
If I might respond to that.
Sorry, just on that point, can I just ask a question? Adil Said and Kerry Olsen. Assuming that transparency is a desirable aim, do you think it adds or detracts to your pursuit of that aim, the fact that you're relying on stolen data?
Indeed.
Well, I think it's the only way we're going to see who the real beneficial owners of these companies are. If it hadn't been for the whistleblowers coming forward, none of this information would be, we wouldn't even be having this debate. We'd just be continuing away in secrecy.
David?
I mean, that's an end justifies the means situation.
Naomi? Oh, okay, sure. Go ahead.
Bob, I agree with you that Bermuda is part of a, I'm sorry?
No, I didn't know where it's coming from. I know it's come from you, Mike.
I agree with you that Bermuda is part of a worldwide system that is hypocritical, that the US and the UK and other countries control that system, the big boys. However, I don't see why Bermuda cannot, why it denies its part in that system. We are, in Bermuda, a tax haven. You have given us the good side. However, the insurance industry is not the only part of Bermuda's international business. We now have 8,000 companies left. We had 16,000 not so many years ago. Those companies, the 8,000, no more than, let's say 1,000 companies are insurance companies. I think that's on the high side. That leaves 7,000 companies. Those 7,000 companies are not doing business in Bermuda. They don't have a real business reason for being in Bermuda, and they don't have management, mind and management in Bermuda. In fact, they're shell companies. I'm mentioned in the ICIJ as being a director and, in one case, a president of a company. I know what my role was. If asked, I was a manager of insurance companies, when in fact I ran an office that administrated insurance companies. The people that made those decisions for companies like Lincoln National, New York Life, Manulife, Liberty Mutual, those type of companies, I went on the decisions that they gave me. Why were they in Bermuda? Mostly for tax reasons. Also for regulation reasons. Life companies have a reason to move their loss reserves offshore so that they can do more business in the US than they could if they left their loss reserves onshore. It's fair to say that we have been the offshore companies, the offshore jurisdictions that you mentioned on a normal basis, the Singapores, the Bermuda, Cayman, the rest of them. No mention is made of the US or the UK. But overall, that group of people in the UK were looking at all the countries. They're not looking at Bermuda. They're looking at all the countries that are do tax haven schemes. So when you say hypocritical, I am embarrassed when you say that Bermuda is not a tax haven. I worked for 40 years in Bermuda and helped the BMA on the Insurance Advisory Council and what have you. So don't tell me that we're not a tax haven. I acted as a director of a company without accepting all the responsibilities of a directorship as normally known and legally accepted. So I'd like you to withdraw the comment that Bermuda is not a tax haven.
Well, I'd like to respond to that. Yes, Mike. Well, I know your views. We've discussed them before in Bermuda. So the phrase tax haven is defined. It's defined by the OECD, and I remember that definition evolved starting in the late 1990s. And as that definition evolved and more, if you like, clarity was put on the phrase tax haven, Bermuda went about changing its laws, its regulations to meet the criteria that were set out by the OECD. And as we speak right now, all of the criteria that the OECD lay out as what is a tax haven, Bermuda has met every one of them. So we do not qualify as a tax haven according to the people that define what a tax haven is. Now, that is not true. That is not true. In any case, let me continue. I'm not finished with you yet, Michael. Right? Now, that's right. We can continue this. Here's the point. Here's the point I'd like to make.
No. Keep it on stage.
That's right. Here's the point I'd like to make. We heard the term shell company, right? Well, what is a shell company? You know what a shell company is? Is a company that just holds assets. It's an investment holding company.
I'm sorry, but that's not true.
There are investment holding companies that hold an asset, right? Whether it's a physical asset or an intellectual asset. There are companies that hold assets all over the world. Holding companies exist all over the world. They only use the word shell companies as relates to offshore financial centers. This is all part of the stereotyping.
Not
right?
true.
Now, here's the other point I'd like to make to you, Michael,
well,
is that
are you going to pile
British
them all on?
that when early in my tenure as Minister of Finance, I was accosted by an official from London saying that the UK wanted to establish a beneficial ownership registry that was public, a public beneficial ownership. This came from the top. This came from Mr. Cameron. And that they were wanting, the UK wanted all the overseas territories that are in financial services, they wanted us to do the same thing, right? And I said, okay, no problem. We in Bermuda have had a beneficial ownership registry for 70 years. That's right, you heard it right, 70 years we've had one. Now, how do I know? Well, I used to work at the Monetary Authority, and I used to operate it. So that's why I know.
Oh, dear.
So we know the beneficial owners of Bermudian companies. And we have a system whereby if shares are transferred to another person, then the system gets updated. Now, to my knowledge, and I'll stand corrected, that I don't know of any other place on planet Earth that has that, right? But we have had it for 70 years, and we've had it, ladies and gentlemen, to protect Bermuda's brand against unsavory elements from the same countries that have been accusing us of unsavory things. So, what we won't do, according to, for my friend's interest, and they know this, is that we won't take that information and just give it to Joe Public, right? It's a situation where we don't think that it's in the public interest for whether or not John Brown owns XYZ company in Bermuda. What we do, we share that information with international law enforcement and international tax authorities. And it's certainly the beneficial ownership information is the response time is 24 hours. And how do I know that? Because I signed the protocol myself with the UK government. 24 hours notice, and in an emergency, 1 hour. So the information that the honorable gentleman who sit beside me got that was stolen from Applebee's, most of it they could have got legitimately through the information exchange that we have with our 100 international tax treaty partners. They could have got it.
Well, law enforcement could have.
Law enforcement and tax authorities. They're the only ones who have a legitimate interest in this.
Excuse me.
All right?
Richard.
Well, Mike, we're going to go somewhere else because we need to share the questions here.
I apologize. I just wanted to also follow up on what the minister was saying. My name is Malcolm Arthurs. I work for an asset recovery firm called Martin Kinney and Company. And a big part of what we do is providing for private citizens and private clients UBO information on companies which have been suspected in money laundering or any sort of illicit activity. And the statement was made that the only way to get this information is by some form of a data leak or theft. And I wanted to address that statement properly because on the private side of things, both from a statutory point of view and from a common law point of view, you can go to court and say, who owns that company? Give me the name of the person who owns that company. And the registered agent, the fiduciary that's superintending the structure, must, on pain of penalty and perhaps loss of license, turn that information over. And I think taking it a little further, it takes credibility away from the offshore jurisdictions that are working very hard to make sure that they operate legally in that regulatory framework if that particular point is not acknowledged. My boss here, I think, was about to make the same comment, but I hope I haven't stolen his thunder, and if to the extent that I have, I sincerely apologize. But it's a very, very important point, and I think certainly not only in the case of Bermuda, but in the British Virgin Islands where I work, that information is required to be held by the registered agent, and it is required to be turned over on court order. When Mark Zuckerberg was being interviewed in front of Congress, in front of the Senate Judicial Panel that he was before, they asked him if he would have been willing to disclose his hotel information, and he said, no, absolutely not. That's private, that's his, and he is entitled to that. I think many people who have companies offshore and who partake in structures legally feel the same way, so long as there is a mechanism by which the information can be made available.
Mr. Richards.
We're back to you, Mike.
Yes, we're back to me. Your first point about having a conversation with you was not true. You listened to me very politely say my piece. You didn't ask me for any backup for what I had to say. And in the end, you just said, well, thank you very much. You don't have any solutions. You're only telling me stuff that I already know. However, let me ask you this question. In the last 50 years, how many white-collar crime criminal cases have there been in Bermuda regarding international business?
I don't know the number, but I know of a
How many?
I don't know the number, right?
There have been some?
Oh, absolutely.
No.
There have been.
No.
Yes, there have, because the most famous one I can tell you. I tell everybody here. The IPOC one. Where it was
excuse me, there was no case in Bermuda.
That is not true. There was a case
The
not only in
case was
Bermuda, but it was a case in BVI as well.
The
right?
case was in
Isn't that right?
BVI.
I mean,
Well,
probably
there was a criminal case in the BVI. There wasn't a criminal case in Bermuda.
Yeah,
but Bermuda participated.
We participated in that. So
Yes, you did.
that's right.
But you didn't go after the facilitators in Bermuda. Mr. Rod Forrest, a lawyer who said but in court that he was the vice president of IPOC. And his only responsibilities was to ensure that that company met the requirements in Bermuda. He didn't know of any of the operations or whatever was going on with the company anywhere else. Yet his signature was on a check. He said, I didn't sign that check for $40 million. But since that case in BVI, Bermuda has not even investigated the situation. They had to employ KPMG to find out who the beneficial owner was, and that didn't go very well. It was Mr. Ryman, who was one of Putin's cronies, and not the Dutch lawyer that said he was the owner. Why would the owner of a law company in Holland have shares in Gazprom or other insurance companies that they claim to have? The judge in the BVI said this company is a money laundering company.
Okay, so
this is a company registered in Bermuda.
Okay, so just to get back on topic here. So the ICIJ, can we expect like a leak of a New York law firm's database or a Munich law firm's database? And don't you think that, quite frankly, any law firm in the world, if you got hold of their database, there's going to be evidence of, you know, criminality or otherwise suspect behavior? So can we expect, you know, do you have it in for offshore senders, or are you just waiting for an onshore law firm's database to be leaked and you would do a similar thing?
Look, we don't have any particular, you know, agenda at ICIJ. We're very story-driven. Basically, if we think it's a good story, we think it's a story in the public interest, we'll do it. To answer your specific question, if someone gave me all of the Delaware data, I would be absolutely delighted, and I would treat it the same way. Again, a big law firm from, say, New York, who we know are often the fronts for many bad actors around the world, I'm sure we'd find that of great public interest as well. You know, I just want to go back to the point you're saying. We're saying this is all so open and so easy, and I think someone else from the audience said, well, was that open and easy? Why has none of this ever come out until the whistleblowers started coming forward with the data? I think with the Panama Papers, we revealed about 120 politicians around the world. And again, with the Paradise Papers, it was another 120. And these are world leaders. A very good example of that was the Prime Minister of Iceland, you know, who was found to have an offshore company in the BVI. He was elected to solve the financial crisis in Iceland after the failure of all the banks, and yet he had a financial interest in the banks, and he was the one that was negotiating the settlement. I mean, that is very important information that the public needed to know about, and of course, once it became known, he had to resign. Again, the Prime Minister of Pakistan had to resign after the Panama Papers because it was found that his children owned multi-million-pound properties in London, and eventually a court in Pakistan found that he was corrupt. And I think he's recently, in the last few days, been banned of ever being a politician again or ever running as the premier of that company again. That's public interest, and I think that is our pursuit as journalists. We don't have any particular vendetta against anyone. I'd happily take information, and again, I'm very easy to find, so please give me the information, and we will look at it, and we will publish only what's in the public interest. I want to repeat what Frederick said earlier. We're not interested in all of the little details we're finding. We found people's passports and bank account details. We didn't publish any of that. We only published what we thought was in the public interest because we're acting as journalists, applying journalistic principles to the material we're looking at.
I want to add some point on the argument you made in regards to public and public only to law enforcement. We have seen in the offshore leaks, Swiss leaks, Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, that hundreds of millions of dollars have been recouped. We have seen arrests. We have seen thousands of investigations based on those data that we made public, based on our investigations, running all around the world. So this is a reason why beneficial ownership registry should be public. And in my opinion, it's kind of hypocritical that you mentioned 9/11 before, because we have seen many studies, academic studies, that opaque company structures do enable financing of terrorists. So jurisdictions like yours, and I don't make any difference between on and offshore, it's secrecy jurisdictions, Secrecy jurisdictions are enablers. Enablers for tax evasion, enablers for corruption, enablers for sanction vesting, and it is enablers for financing of terrorism.
I have something you want to do?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to answer a few comments here. First, who decides what public interest is? And that's a very important question. And that's a question that, being a politician for 20 years, and you know, many people are afraid, they're loath to get involved in public service now because everything is open. Your family, you know, what you do in your spare time, whether you play golf and stuff like that. And we have to understand that we need to have an honest conversation about what is right and how far do you want to push the limit between transparency and having some privacy. Now, in no way am I saying that people should be protected if they are doing things that cross that line. No way am I saying that. But the fact of the matter is that we all need some privacy in our lives, and if we want to sit here and debate that, it can be hard for you to convince me otherwise. So who decides what the public interest is? Now, I have great respect for many journalists, but if we allow journalists to openly decide what public interest is, we need to have a debate so everyone else can get involved in that. That's an important point to make. Now, Bermuda, you're going to have to push us hard to get us change our position on the beneficial ownership. Remember, before, as my colleague said, before the rest of the world even started talking about these registers, we had one. And I remember the conversations we had over in the UK, and my colleague's been fairly tame today, based on some of the conversations we had with them. And they came to us and said, you know, we want yours to be public. They weren't even discussing having a registry. And so when we talk about secrecy, first we go from transparency to secrecy. You know, we like to just blow things up like the 20 million. But here's the, I think it's the Tax Justice Network. Here's their secrecy levels. Bermuda's ranked 36. 36. Who's number 1? Switzerland. Who's number 2? USA. Who's number 7? Germany. Who's number 21? Canada. Who's number 23? UK. Who's number 25? France. I've named almost all the world powers, the players who make the rules. They're trying to dictate to us, the small guys, what we do, but they rank way ahead of us. So guys, we will play. We will do what's appropriate, but you're not going to play us for a fool. As a former premier said, do you expect us to fish and farm for the rest of our life? We've had a registry for 70 years. We're open. We exchange information. The 4 principles to be considered to get off a tax haven list, if they ever want to put you on the list. You'll stay on the list forever by the OECD if you can't make all 4 of these points. You lack transparency. You lack information exchange. You have no substantial activity. You have no or nominal tax on income. We've met those marks. We love having a conversation here today. And the only way we'll move forward as a world where you need to have capital flow across the borders to stimulate trade, to provide opportunity, jobs, and hopes, is for us to have a discussion where we listen to each other and we come to some good conclusions. Thank you.
We have a question here.
Hi, hello. I just really wanted to make a comment, perhaps, rather than ask questions. I've listened to all of this debate, and I think fundamentally it washes back and forth between privacy versus public interest, and we could all spend forever debating that point. I really just wanted to very briefly recite some stuff that, rather than perhaps debate this in a public forum via the press, we each, in our respective professional endeavours, and particularly the law enforcement agencies that we heard from earlier, should actually get on and do our jobs within the legislative framework and the laws that are currently in force. I established the world's first offshore enforcement centre, enforcement division, in the Isle of Man in 1991. My first job was to get the world's first offshore freestanding Morava injunction without a local cause of action. That was in about 92 or 3, I forget the year. It's a case called SIB versus Lloyd Wright. And the mechanisms are there. They're out there. So one actually just has to get on and do the work rather than debate the argument. I would like to know, not least because my firm offers a range of services to assist this argument, I would like to know what analysis is being done on the information in the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers for the jurisdictions that were responsible for enforcing the existing law in place at the time, and actually hauling the regulatory authorities and the financial intelligence units to account for failing, if they failed, to progressing the prosecutions and regulatory actions that ought to have been done. Otherwise, it is all just salacious hot air.
That's what sells newspapers.
Indeed.
Have law enforcement asked for your data, Gerard?
No, but we do know that there are about 150 inquiries just from the Panama Papers alone that are continuing. I think last year mentioned about $500 million has been collected around the world in taxes that should have been collected the first time. Yeah, I think there were another 7 countries announced investigations after the Paradise Papers. But you do make a very good point, that maybe they should have been looking a bit harder, I guess. But again, it goes back to secrecy. They make the same arguments we make, that how are we supposed to know who's doing what unless we have a lead or unless we have some sort of clue. And I guess what they have now from our publicly available data, which is on our Offshore Leaks website, they've been able to use that information and do research, and then of course they've got enforcement powers that we don't have. They can ask people questions we can't ask.
Yes, indeed they can, but you can also, all of us can, and I think it's in all of us in this room in our interest, we can track the prosecutions. International requests for assistance are published on all financial intelligence units' websites. All of the offshore jurisdictions that publish that information. The court listings are public. Regulatory authorities issue public statements of censure. All of the jurisdictions have fining powers. The BVI, for example, fined Mossack Fonseca for failure of anti-money laundering regulation. But where is the analysis to take your data back to the respective corporate service providers, offices, and then link it to regulatory action? I think, if the jurisdictions, and I'm based in Jersey, although my practice is across the whole of the offshore world, all of the jurisdictions where I work are serious about evidencing their compliance. And I completely agree with the points from the offshore colleagues on the platform. We believe we do have a good story to tell, but only one half of the argument is often progressed. I was very interested, and they're too senior people and too senior to have anything other than respect extended to them. But I was really just biting my lip with the gentleman from the IRS this morning, promoting the notion that they might take some sort of action against nominees. Well, have a look at the Commonwealth of Australia, who prosecuted for tax fraud. Eglishaw, who supported, according to the Australian courts, Paul Hogan, Crocodile Dundee, evade his tax. The Australian authorities went straight for the trustees and prosecuted them for tax fraud. I think everybody simply has to exercise the powers and the responsibilities they have, and we need to be held accountable for them.
I think Hogan also accused Eglishaw of stealing his money, if my memory serves me correctly.
And I should point out that I think he featured in the Paradise Papers as well.
Can I add something to this? My name is Jack DeCliver. I'm with Baker DeCliver, Washington, D.C. One of the things that I think is very dangerous on a panel like this is your vocabulary. Stop using the term offshore, even though it's in this particular organization. Every jurisdiction that is a major financial center is offshore as soon as you cross a border, maybe less so in the EU. but you're still offshore. I am a 20-year veteran of the United States Department of Justice, Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Section, recently departed, so I'm dead to my organization. But I can tell you one thing, at least for the journalists, this kind of Mickey Mouse stuff has been going on for decades. As for who's responsible, rich people. Not just the Americans, they didn't invent this, the G7 did, which point was subtly or not so subtly being made. And I would like to thank Bermuda and the Bahamas for supporting my law enforcement efforts for 20 years. But let's be careful about this. Let's not get overly dramatic. Let's not overly centralize. Look, if the U.S. Department of Justice is doing work based on the Paradise Papers or the Panama Papers, they can't tell you. It's a one-way street. They can't use that information because it was obtained in a manner not completely traceable or that will cause huge evidentiary problems and ruin their cases. So they're going to have to reconstruct it. But at the same time, I am happy that finally somebody in the media is paying attention to this, because we've been doing it for a long time. And if you've read our press releases, it's there. So a round of applause for this great group of panelists for each coming out here with different views and somehow not murdering each other while they're up there. Thanks.
Don't have to worry about that.
Oh.
David, I'd like to respond to the gentleman who just spoke. I agree with what you say about, offshore really isn't offshore. There's offshore places onshore. The problem with that concept, though, is that only dots on the map are being basically punished. Like the latest round of punishment is the EU Code of Conduct group coming out of Brussels, right? They're using extrajudicial means to basically state-sponsor bully dots on the map for being offshore financial centers. They've got two lists. They've got a black list and a gray list. Bermuda's on the gray list. I think some of our overseas territory colleagues are on the gray list, some are on the black list. But neither lists include the United States. Neither list includes the Netherlands or Luxembourg, right? So, none of this is even-handed. They're only going for jurisdictions they think can be easily bullied. So while I get your point, those of us in offshore financial centers continue to face extrajudicial sanctions by large organizations, either OECD or in this case, the EU Code of Conduct Group, for things that are not based on law at all, just based on size and power. And that's the world that we live in as offshore financial centers.
Gerardo, can you give him the mic? Thanks.
I absolutely feel your pain. Being a former citizen of an EU nation that shall remain nameless, but you just named, I think yelling at the powers that be and calling them hypocrites isn't going to advance your cause. I think the way to go about it is simply to say, listen, you misunderstand how things are. Come to my jurisdiction, let me explain it to you, and stop looking at these kind of ridiculous caricatures, because it is a caricature, because it's one of the things that I believe that needs to be done is that, look, there are international financial centers, and that's what I would call your jurisdictions, at least the ones representing jurisdictions right now, as opposed to offshore centers. I mean, you're conveniently island, so it's kind of hard to say you're not offshore, but you're not really offshore. You're your own independent nation. And so is the United States. It's only not offshore because it has two borders, but frankly, between Canada and Mexico, those jurisdictions are kind of offshore. The United States was a high-risk money laundering jurisdiction up until March of 2017, miraculously, by its own State Department, but it is no longer. Are you right that a lot of these international organizations aren't taking a hard look at themselves? Absolutely. It's become political and hypocrisy abound. But don't call them hypocrites. Just tell them that they misunderstand things.
So we need to wrap up for lunch. If we could give a warm thanks for the panelists.